All right, welcome to another installment of the Sourcegraph podcast. Today I'm here with Daniel Stenberg, creator and maintainer of cURL, the most popular CLI for working with network protocols and requests. Daniel is also an active member of the IETF, where he has contributed to the working groups for Speedy, which became HTTP2, and now Quick, which I believe is expected to become HTTP3. Hey Daniel, how's it going?
Hello, it's a good day here today.
Awesome. You just got done with a release, right?
Exactly, my 209th release since the beginning, actually. So yes.
Wow, that's quite a journey. I guess going back all the way to the beginnings of that journey, you know, when you think about what got you into programming originally, what was it that was your first introduction to the world of computers?
I had a friend who owned a Commodore 64 that sort of teased me into what programming would be like, or what computers and working with computers could be like. So that sort of was such a attraction to me that I managed to get myself a Commodore 64 when I was 14 years old.
And what sort of things did you do on the Commodore 64 when you got it?
Oh, well, I was already from the beginning, I was sort of fascinated by just the ability to, command the computer to do what I wanted to do. So that was what I wanted to do, and I started immediately, learn. And when you did it on the Commodore 64, it was basic from the beginning, since it had a basic interpreter from the beginning. So you just start, 10, print, hello, go to 20, go to 10, and stuff like that. So it was really easy to begin with. And you could change colors on the background, on the border, stuff like that. Basic stuff. I don't know really why, but it drew me into it. So yes, I was hooked really quickly.
That's awesome. And when you started programming in BASIC, were you making we talked to a lot of people on the show. They got into computers through games. For you, was it games, or was it like some other kind of like intellectual?
Well, I think games was fun, at least to begin with. So it was partly that. It was also just the challenge of I wanted to do my own stuff, right? I wanted to do my own games. And then I also rather soon got into the demo scene on Commodore 64, and I watched a lot of demos, people doing crazy things, flying around colors and images and playing music, and that was fun. And I wanted to be part of that too. Get the computer to do those fun things.
Yeah, so you're a teenager growing up in Sweden, and talk more about that demo scene. So my understanding is like the demo scene. When you say demo, it was really like people doing cool tricks with their computers. Like, hey, look at what I can do. Is that right?
Exactly. It was mostly a show-off thing. So you put in a lot of graphics, flying things, music, sound effects, and you try to make it a bit, And you usually just try to impress the other demo groups. So you would try to do something fun that made some cool graphic tricks, or and the Commodore 64 was actually a computer full of, I could say like, so the graphics chip in it was rather undocumented, and you could trick it to do a lot of things that wasn't really documented how to do it. So you could sort of learn and try to do things, and you could find out, wow, you could actually accomplish this if you did this that wasn't documented anywhere. So it was a sort of an adventure into the wild, and try to do funny things and put that into those demos, and look at this, I could do this fun trick when I blah blah blah.
Do you remember like what specifically that you could trick the chip into doing that was...
Oh yeah, I remember one of those things that I think, well, I discovered, at least. I don't know if I was the first one, but that was how, the graphic chips actually had sprites, which was, 8 independent graphic units you could put anywhere on the screen and move them around. You could change the positions. You had 8 of those. And very early on, before my time, actually, someone discovered that if you moved them, when the raster image goes across the screen, you could move them. So you could make them appear as more than 8. So you could have 16, 24, 32 of them, if you just move them at the right time and move them back again. So you could make them appear as a lot of them. And that was fun, of course, because suddenly there weren't only 8 of them. You could have, maybe 40 or something.
Oh, wow.
48. That was sort of the max. If you just, move them correctly and switch them around at the correct time. But I remember at one point, I remember that you could stretch those sprites. If you just inserted this. You could actually resize the sprite at a certain point, and if you did that at the right point, you can actually stretch those sprites to actually stretch across the entire screen. So, and if you then just did stretch, unstretch, stretch, unstretch at the right positions on the raster lines, you can actually get some sort of, waving effects and stuff like that. So it was completely pointless, but it was fun, and you could do something with it, and it was graphical. And
that's awesome. How big was this community in, yeah, you grew up in Sweden, right? Stockholm?
Yes, I was then in Sweden, and I had my younger brother was also into this, and I have a few local friends. So we started this demo group here in Huddinge, south of Stockholm, Sweden. And then after a while, we got to know others around in Sweden. So we joined and we created a demo group. We called ourselves Horizon. We went to all these different demo meetings in Sweden where we met up, hundreds of others. Carrying along small TVs and Commodore 64s, gathering in a school over a weekend or something, and did a lot of that. So, I don't know how big it was. We were at least commonly more than, several hundreds of people in a school in Sweden. And sometimes, bringing in people from all over the Nordic countries, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and so it was a great time. Yes.
That sounds like it's such a fun scene. So, from there, did you go straight away into, like programming professionally, or how did that initial hobby evolve?
I think at that time, a lot of people, like a lot of people, I of course also got sort of a bit bored by doing those demo things after a while, because at some point you feel that you reached the end of what you can do. Maybe that wasn't true, but it was the feeling anyway. So I wanted to change it up and do something different. And at that time, Commodore was made, the Commodore 64 was made by Commodore. And they then shipped the Amiga, which was their big brother computer. It was shipped in late 80s, early 90s. I don't remember exactly when late 80s, I guess. So I sort of switched to that too, because it was sort of the common transition for a lot of people who worked a lot with the Commodore 64. But on the Amiga, it wasn't as much fun as to do demos and stuff, because it was a completely different universe. It was a little bit like, removing all the fences, and there were no limits at all anymore, because so you could do so much more and so much different things. So it felt a completely different universe. Doing demos wasn't as much fun. Trying to do games, no, it wasn't that fun. So I don't remember exactly how I got into it, but I fell into C programming, and I decided I want to do my own text editor instead on the Amiga. So I started learning C and doing a text editor.
Okay, so Amiga was no longer BASIC. You're programming C. That is like a wildly different kind of an environment.
Yes. So exactly, the Amiga doesn't have any interpreter from the beginning. So you actually, more like a traditional computer nowadays, you had to actually load something to do it. And yeah, I got into C programming at work, since by that time, I actually, roughly the same time, I started working for IBM. So I met some friends who were into C programming, and so I started to fiddle around with C in general.
Well, one thing that's interesting about your background is you actually didn't go to university, right? You kind of...
Right, exactly. So I did, in Sweden we had a mandatory military service back then, so I did that, and then I was ready and prepared to go into university to do some studying. I actually applied for some courses, and then at the same time I got a job offer from a friend to start working at IBM with their AIX machines. And I figured, sure, I can postpone the university for a while. I can go work at IBM and see what happens. And then I never got back to the university thing.
Cool. What did you do at IBM?
I worked with installing and preparing those RS 6000 machines for customers. So it was pretty basic. Setting up things, installing them, inserting a lot of tapes to install different softwares, customizing them before they got here into Sweden. We prepared them, and then they were shipped out to the customers here in the Stockholm area, I guess.
Interesting. So this is the RX 6000.
Yes.
What type of machine was this? Like, what did it look like?
They were huge. So they were, like small closets, usually powerful machines with powerful hardware, and they ran AIX then. So they were really IBM's Unix machines.
AIX was a flavor of Unix? It was like,
yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, it still is, I guess. I think it still exists.
There's
I
still
don't
like
know.
IBM mainframes out there, probably somewhere in some old company.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure it still exists in a lot of places. Nothing ever really dies, you know.
Okay, cool. So you're at IBM. You're setting up these big RS-6000 machines, and in your spare time, you're kind of toying around with the Amiga. What was that like? You know, like by day, you're working with these like giant hunking like business machines. By night, you had this like very personal computing environment.
Yeah, but they really went hand in hand because at my work, I realized the world of open source, command lines, Unix, Emacs, C code, man pages, and that it was sort of a little bit how I got into how to do C programming, and I learned Emacs and tried it out at work, and that's got me also inspired quite a lot to do for my own text editor at Amiga. I got a lot of inspiration from Emacs on AIX. So it was a little bit back and forth. And then I started to participate at work. Some of the guys actually, someone like of a own personal project, they started to write a little program that could help automatically install these machines that we were doing during the day, because it was a manual labor. You actually had to insert a terminal, do a lot of typing.
Yeah.
Cursor up, select, blah, blah, blah. And we actually worked on doing that by automation. So we actually wrote tools to do that automated. And I was sort of helping out there, and I got into C program a little bit thanks to that.
It's kind of like a very early version of DevOps in a way.
Yeah, in a way, yes. Yeah. It ended then when they actually canceled and shut down the entire department. So
oh, wow.
It didn't really survive.
That's a shame. Tell me more about the text editor that you wrote for the Amiga. What was the motivation there, and what sort of features did it have?
Well, actually, the motivation actually was because when I started to program on the Amiga, I figured that the text editors we had, they were a bit limited. And at the same time, I got into using Emacs on the AIX at IBM at work. So I figured there's a potential here. There's an ability to do a lot of fun things if you could just, do this. So I got a lot of inspiration from Emacs and brought it back to the Amiga, because the Amiga was really, it wasn't really able to run Emacs for real back then, because it was a 68K CPU at 8 megahertz in the original one. It was really a slow thing, so you had to squeeze out the performance a little bit more. So I actually made it programmable. I wrote my own programming language called FPL, actually Frex programming language. The editor was FrexEd.
What was that programming language like? Was it?
It was very stupid. It's very C-like. It was more or less like interpreted C. I don't know why, because it wasn't really making any sense, but it was close to my mind, I guess. So.
That's awesome. I know people listening to this. We have a lot of Vim users in our community, so I'm sure the question they'll ask is like, why not just use VI in that situation?
Yeah, well, the answer is pretty obvious actually, because back in those, I started at IBM 1991. There was no Vim back then, and VI was a really, really basic editor. Emacs was way more advanced and powerful back then. So back then there was, for me, and I don't think for anyone at that point in time, there wasn't really any question. So if you wanted to automatic indent your source code, for example, VI couldn't do that. Emacs could. So it was, stuff like that.
Got it. Okay, cool. So this editor then you're building was really just you're taking the best parts of Emacs and making it runnable in the more resource constrained environment of the Amiga. Is that kind of the general idea?
Yes, sort of like that. For a while, until when that was fun, and we made it share where people actually had to pay to get the full experience. So a few hundred people actually paid for it. It was fun. So yeah, it went on for a while until I did this with a friend, and we had a lot of fun. And then I switched work. I got a real programming gig. So I started working as an actual software developer in 1993. And then I got more into learning about what the internet is, that it exists, and what to do on it. And then my interest slowly sort of grew into to do more Unix programming and more network programming. So I slowly went away from Amiga.
Talk a bit about the early days of the web. What was that like? You got into professional software development in 1993. That was probably, right at the right moment where the internet was kind of taking off and you had all these new protocols emerging.
Yeah, and I actually started trying it out a little bit. The first few steps at IBM, people showed me, how to do search on Archie and do Gopher and everything. So yeah, it was really basic and hard to actually understand or get the full power. So sure we could start sending emails and everything, but and in 1993, 94 something, I also discovered IRC to start chatting, and I think IRC opened my eyes a little bit. A lot of people out there, a lot of collaboration, and that everyone actually is connected. And at about that time, also the web started to appear for real. So people started to actually ship browsers and everything. So then things started to look really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Talk a little bit more about the IRC community. That's something that, doesn't really exist anymore in the same way that it did these days. What was it like being on IRC in the 90s?
Yeah, but sure. So I discovered IRC 93, 94 something, and it's a chat. It's a way to chat online, right? And you join room or channels. Really, they're not rooms. They're actually channels in the IRC language. But anyway, so you could join, and there were, back then I joined FNet, which was the major network back then. So you could join channels with several hundred people in them. It was big back then, so and a lot of people from everywhere chatting about whatever. And I've immediately, of course, found channels with people interested in topics that I was interested in. I actually joined several Amiga channels earlier in the early days because I came from Amiga there, so I found people talking about Amiga. That was fun, and I started to talk there, and I realized that in IRC and in IRC channels, especially back then, not so much these days, but you needed bots, and in particular bots to protect the channel because there was a lot of attacks and just abuse
and spammers.
Yeah, okay, and just downright attacks. So you could just take over channels by being aggressively. You could do certain things to actually take over channels, kick everyone else out, and just be rude and annoying, like annoying kids. So you could actually do that. So and in order to prevent that from happening, you could actually run and use defense bots that could sort of help you defend your channel. And stuff like that, and the bots could also be more silly. You could have a bot to help you explain things or answer frequently asked questions, or just like a bot, a robotic user who could do whatever. So I started working. A friend of mine there in one of those IRC channels started working on a bot for IRC, and so I started sort of helping out on that IRC bot. That was more or less my first adventures into TCP/IP programming in C on Unix. I thought it was great fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, in some ways, it's almost like the world we live in now. There's a lot of analogs back to those days. Like these days, Discord and Slack. A lot of people run channels for that. But I guess the difference now is that like there's all these kind of like companies behind these applications. Whereas in those days, it really felt like it was just like a bunch of open protocols and people just kind of like.
It was certainly more of that kind, yeah. So more open protocols, people running servers for the good of their sort of for the fun of it because they could do it. Probably they worked at some universities or companies or so they ran stuff, and it was more of and more open protocols. So I could actually read the IRC specification. How do you actually write a bot? Just follow the specification, and you can actually make a bot.
Do you have any thoughts of like comparing that world versus our current world? Are there things that you miss about those early days of the internet that you wish it still had, or do you think things have mostly evolved for the better?
It has mostly evolved to the better in the way that, of course, it worked back then because we were all enthusiasts and we could manage when everything just broke down for a while and we could just wait and fix it and stuff like that. So, and as I said, the big channels back then, they had several hundreds of people joined, right? But it was still small. It was still a small community, and I think that's why it also worked, because didn't ever grow up until millions or hundreds of millions of users, because it really couldn't. It didn't scale like that. So you need something. And how do you scale something like that? I think you need money and some sort of investment to make sure that happens. So I think it's a necessary way to move forward.
Cool. Makes sense. So you got into network programming through IRC. It was kind of the early days of the web. At what point did you start building this command line utility that would become curl?
Yeah, so I was working on that IRC bot, and you could do a lot of things with that IRC bot. You could ask it questions, it could respond. And one of the days, and since we were in international channels, in my Amiga channels there, we talked about buying hardware, buying services, or whatever. And one of these days, it struck me, of course, the bot should be able to translate currencies for me. How much is $100 in Swedish crowns today? Or in German marks, or a lot of those other European currencies that are gone now. But so, how do you do that? I just need to download some currency rates every now and then, and make the bot do that. So, I just need to download currency rates. Where are those? So I found an HTTP site just hosting a lot of 40, 30 currencies. I just need to download them. So I just need a little tool to download. So I just Google, before Google existed. I guess I used Alta Vista. I don't remember actually. And how a little tool to download HTTP. So I found a tool called HTTP Get. It was actually written by a Brazilian developer, and he released his first version. Actually, check this afterwards. His first version in November 1996, and I think I used his first version. So I got that, and it worked almost the way I wanted to. So I fixed it and sent an email back to the guy. So here's a patch. I think it should do this as well. And then I found and then I adjusted some other things and sent a patch to him again. And after a few patches, he said, "Oh well, maybe you can just become the maintainer of this. I don't want to work with this anymore." So I became the maintainer of HTTP Get then in late 1996.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like nowadays we think of curl as almost like a standard Unix tool, and it's kind of startling to hear that it wasn't invented in like the 1970s, like a bunch of the other Unix tools are. But it makes total sense, right? Like HTTP didn't come along until later. But like back in the day, you basically just had to like roll your own HTTP like requester. There was no kind of like standard tool in
exactly. There was no standard tool, and actually. It's kind of fun since everyone compares curl with wget because it's a command line tool for the similar thing. And wget was actually also born in the early 1996 under a different name as well. I don't remember. I think it was called. Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, at that time, at least I didn't find it, or maybe I didn't think it was good enough for me. I don't remember exactly why, but I went this path anyway. So. And it was a different time and era. It wasn't as easy to find software also at that point in time. And also, I was very much focused on getting this little tiny tool for my currency translation service. I didn't want anything complicated, HTTP Get, there was 300 lines of code. Perfect for my...
and written in C at that point?
Yes, exactly, yeah. It probably had no error checks or anything. It was probably horrible. But it was just for my little fun, so why not?
Yeah. How did you find it? This is before GitHub. It might have even before SourceForge.
It was way before SourceForge too. So yeah, I think I just searched for it using Alta Vista. I'm pretty sure because it was years before we got Google too. So HTTP tool get download C. I don't remember exactly how I did it. I have no traces left to remind me either. So.
And so when you submitted patches, then how did you submit patches? Did you email diffs or
Yes, exactly. Just the diff and email the patches to the guy who actually had his email address in the source code. And it was only one file of source code too, so just one C file.
And were you using version control at that point, or was it?
No, not initially. No.
Okay. So you just email the whole file over and like manually like specify which lines were added? And
no, I think it actually, I had his version of the code and my version, and just ran a diff. And here's the diff from your version. Here's what I think you should apply. So because the diff and the apply commands, they existed already then. So they were useful.
Okay, so you started submitting patches at some point. The Brazilian program had transferred maintainership over to you, and then what? Like, how was there a point at which it became more of like a standard tool that other people started adopting and using?
It was actually pretty soon. So I put it up online on my web page, and again, how do people find that? I remember, I don't exactly remember at what point in time, but there existed sites where you can, more like directory sites, when you could announce, I have a program that does this, put it under the category FTP client, HTTP client, blah, blah. Like Fresh Meat was an early one, and there existed those kinds of catalogs so people could find it. And pretty soon people actually started to submit patches in the same style. I started using version control. I started using actually RCS a little while before I switched to CVS. And then after a while, I found a currency site using Gopher, so I added Gopher support.
Gopher is another web protocol?
Yeah, it's similar to HTTP. More, it's actually way simpler. So it supported two protocols, but then it couldn't be HTTP GET anymore. So I switched name to URL GET, because now it's for URLs. I actually changed so that it actually worked on URLs, HTTP and Gopher. Started getting more patches. I got proxy support and blah, blah, blah. And then one day I added FTP support. And after a while, early 1998, actually, I added support for FTP upload. And then it wasn't GET anymore. It was doing put as well, so it couldn't be URL GET. So it was I changed name again. So it became cURL in 1998 in March. And by that time, I watched sort of, the currency translation thing. I had forgotten about that. I was working on my command line tool. I didn't care about IRC bots anymore, so it was just fun to do this command line tool. So I sort of faded away from the IRC things and worked more and more on just cURL.
It's funny. I feel like there's a lot of infrastructure tooling that maybe gets created that way. There's originally some end user problem that motivates the creation of that piece of infrastructure, but then things change and the end user problem goes away or becomes less important. But where you're left is like a piece of infrastructure that is pretty generic and multi-purpose and can be used for many other things.
Absolutely. And I think, scratching your own itch, that's a very powerful motivation to actually get stuff done. So yeah, I think a lot of things start that way.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so cURL is evolving. What was it like building something in open source back in those days when people were kind of like emailing you patches, and when there wasn't GitHub, or when there wasn't as strong like a history, I guess, of open source development? What was that like?
I guess it was similar today, but just slower and more spotty in contributions and people actually discovering the project and doing anything. But in 1999, very end of 1999, SourceForge was created and suddenly appeared, and SourceForge was actually, it was pretty good beginning of a central place where people could put things and get discovered, and also make it slightly easier for people to contribute code back, because they could find it and they could actually see the code and things like that. So pretty soon it was available like that for people to find it. And then it, slowly, just gradually got people's attention. People sent me patches, they sent me feature requests, I added code.
At what point did you become aware of wget?
I don't have that recorded anywhere.
Okay, got it.
I guess it wasn't that far along. I guess it was just a year or two into the game, so that when someone pointed it out. But by that point in time, I think cURL has already developed into a direction where it wasn't. A lot of people, of course, compare cURL with wget, but in my mind, they're fairly different. They have an overlap where they do the same things, but in a lot of things, they actually do different things. And so in my mind, I had it set up what cURL was supposed to do, and then I realized W existed, but they're not the same. So I never thought of giving up curl and just go the wget way, or so. No.
That makes sense. For folks listening who may be unfamiliar with like the distinction, like how would you describe the differences in purpose and in philosophy of the two tools?
Yeah, exactly. So of course this is my highly biased way of looking at it. So someone else will look at it differently. But from my point of view, wget is primarily done for downloading a file or a whole tree of data. wget can actually parse HTML and figure out a website and download a lot of documents from the website. Curl doesn't understand the content at all, so it can't download anything recursively or understand web content. So curl is much more of a way to do HTTP, more raw, fiddle with it. You can download files with both of them, but curl is more of a doing more HTTP fiddling or more transfers up and down. And over time, of course, curl does a lot more protocols and a lot more different things when it comes to internet transfers in a variety of ways. While wget has remained more sort of the same thing as it actually was from a long time ago. It hasn't had this feature creep that we have in curl.
Yeah, curl has gotten quite advanced. Like it's still under active development, and it keeps evolving along with the web standards of our time, I think.
Yeah, quite a lot actually. Yes.
Cool. I mean, being the creator and main maintainer of this like tool that has become such a standard way of issuing requests, you must have had kind of like a front seat to the evolution of web standards, from the 90s through the 2000s and beyond. What was it like to partake in that, and like how did you get involved in the conversation around how these standards evolve?
When I did my first sort of steps into HTTP, I only, I got that initial tool from someone, and I could just read the source code. Oh, wow, this is how you talk HTTP, and I continued from that without even realizing, who decides this and where is the documentation specifying the format. I just, wow, cool. It's a source code that does HTTP. I'll just extend the source code. But of course, after a while, I realized, well, there's actually specifications detailing this. So, I could add HTTP 1.1 support by reading the specification, since it had HTTP 1.0 from the beginning. And
interesting.
Yeah, exactly. HTTP 1.1 was actually the first specification actually came in 1997, which was actually sort of in the same time frame. But it took me a long time until I actually realized that this is something I can have a say in, and that I could actually, talk to a community that is also interested in, the protocol details. So I could sit at home and, and be angry about details in the protocols. Why are we doing this? And I don't understand this. And it took me years. I don't remember exactly how many, but I don't think I did. I think I found out about IETF and the HTTP working group in the mid 2000s, so maybe 2006 something. I joined the mailing list, and it took me a long time until I actually said anything on that mailing list. But a mailing list dedicated to talking about HTTP, the protocol and implementations, and that was awesome for me, because it was like a gold mine in just similar minds. So yeah, and in there I learned that I could also contribute and speak my mind about what things that are actually working, not working, and my experiences from curl and so on.
Yeah. What was that like? I imagine you had maybe like a somewhat distinct perspective, because I know very little about the standards committees, but my impression of them is, very active voices there are things like web browsers, right? Like there's all these web browsers now that they have end users, they have like features that they want to add, but curl is a command line tool. So did you find that you had like a different perspective in that conversation?
Yes, and I think I still have that. I think that's still a very important different perspective and a different sort of mindset on how to do protocols and how to do transfers and all of those things. So I repeatedly think that it's a very important thing for me to remind everyone that wait a minute, we don't all, load things like this. We don't all waste megabytes of stuff just to do things milliseconds faster. Some of us do it this way. So I think that is very important. And I also immediately, of course, found this struggle that a lot of those working on those standards, they're working on that more or less full time, while when you're, you're a spare time hacker who just want to follow along and voice your opinion every now and then, it can be really hard because suddenly, the discussion takes off really, really fast in one direction. And if you only spend, an hour or two every day, it can be really hard to keep up with that and to actually have a say, because and it's also very complicated, right? You need to actually know what you're talking about, because if you don't, they won't listen to you. So because you can't just be rambling on things, you actually have to keep up with the discussion, the facts, the protocols, where are we going, where should we go, and stuff like that. So, but when you can actually keep up and you can actually contribute, I think it's very valuable, because I think in a lot of ways, I think I can contribute, and I think I can, and the other way around, I can actually understand where people think we should go, and oh right, they read that section in the spec like this. Of course, I thought about it completely different. That's why it doesn't work for me, and and then I can adjust, and everything works better. And when we all can do it like that, I think the entire internet can actually work better, because we all understand each other better.
So this whole time you're developing curl in your spare time. You're at the same time you're holding down just like a full-time job as a programmer. Is that right?
Yes. So I changed jobs a couple of times, but I kept working usually as a consultant doing embedded Linux systems. So I did my curl spare time, usually a few hours every evening, pretty much. So kept up with the mailing list, the issues, the working on things.
Got it. That's incredible. Was there any kind of like interplay between your kind of like full-time day job and curl, or were those mostly kind of like distinct?
They were shockingly separate, and I sometimes thought that it would be more fun if they could actually be more joined. But I don't know. Maybe it was more of my decision of going into embedded systems, so they didn't overlap much. Actually, it was mostly my development stuff at work and my development stuff with curl. They were mostly separate.
Got it.
So exactly, at work I did embedded systems. Of course, that was often network related too, but rarely HTTP, rarely curl stuff. So pretty much until the end of 2013. So that when I was ending a particular project, and I sort of reached out to my community and asked, so is there anyone who has any new gig for me coming up next? And then I got an offer to start at Mozilla.
Got it. And what was that like?
So I joined as an employee at Mozilla in 2014, and then I could suddenly, my two worlds could, be joined. They could collide. So now suddenly I could work with HTTP, networking, cookies, DNS, TCP, and all of that during day and during night. And actually had some permission to do some curl stuff during work hours as well. So yeah, that was great. And everything was open source too. So that was really my first full-time open source work. That was awesome.
What were your major projects at Mozilla?
Well, I worked in the networking team called the NECO, which is the sort of the network stack. That's basically HTTP, caching, cookies, stuff like that, DNS. So it was a lot of things that I was very familiar with from curl, but in a browser context. So it was quite of a steep learning curve anyway, because it's messier, more threads, more objects, a lot of more code, a lot of more developers, a lot of more bugs, a lot of more complicated situations. But of course, very educational, and I learned a lot, and I met a lot of great people there.
Yeah, that's awesome. When you were at Mozilla, did you have opportunity to use their code search engine? I believe now it's called like SearchFox. Back in the day, I think it was like DXR or MXR or...
Yes, and with such a huge code base, such as Firefox, you need a good code search to find your way around, because it's I don't remember exactly. I don't know how much code there is now, but there was something like 20 million lines of code when I was there. So it was, so much code and so much of that running concurrently. So yes, it's a tricky code base to work with, to put it mildly.
In terms of like your kind of like toolkit, at Mozilla and also like these days, what does your development environment look like? What kind of tools do you reach for? What's part of your day-to-day tool set?
Oh, I'm a very traditional conservative guy. As I mentioned, I learned C when I was back in 1991 something, and I still work primarily in C. So I'm really stuck with the C development, and then also in that set of tools pretty much. So I build everything with make, I run configure, I use GDB, I use Emacs, I use terminals, and so that's the environment I'm in. Of course, a bunch of terminals, a bunch of browser windows when I work, but that's pretty much what I do.
Awesome. And in terms of like editor plugins, are there any that you favor? Or is it mostly like stock configuration?
I do most is stock. I have edited .emacs, of course, but most of my things are actually very vanilla and ordinary, and mostly in a way that I sort of try to stick to stock so that I can move around to different computers, different installations without them being too hostile or different, so I easily move around.
When you look at like the kind of tooling that other people are using these days, like is there a reason that you prefer the kind of like stock Emacs, terminal based setup? What are the things that you like about it that you just like?
Oh, I think it's a lot of just about habit and being accustomed to the ways of working that I already know. So my fingers are trained like this, much more than me, thinking that this is the superior way or the best way, because obviously there are really cool editors and plugins and fancy ways of doing things. And one of these days I might change to that, but I'm so accustomed to this. This is sort of the way I do it. I've grown up like this, so I think I'm very productive like this. I find my ways around the code, what I want to do like this. So I'm sticking to it. So I'm not breaking the team that I think is winning.
And you're still actively coding today, right?
Yes, a lot actually. Well, mostly debugging, but that I guess that's included in coding.
What was the kind of like the last rabbit hole that you went down? In terms of debugging.
Surprisingly often you can find them on and over and over again. There's a new rabbit hole you can go down into because there are so many, and you think stuff that has been around for a long time, they should be fairly solid by now, but no. So for example, the other day, well, a month ago or so now, I found this .NET RC file format, which is a file format that was created in 1978. So it's pretty old, 44 years or something. So it's a protocol. It's a file that you can. It was originally made for the FTP tool, I think, maybe. So you can insert username, password for this machine, blah blah blah. And just a while ago, someone pointed out that I have a password with a space in it. I need to specify it in my .NET RC file, and cURL doesn't handle it. Really? A space in your password? Who does that?
Yeah.
Well, I guess that was not the question I was supposed to ask. So how do you support a space in your password in .NET RC? So I got in a really deep rabbit hole there, realizing that of course there's no specification for the file format. There are a number of different tools that support the .NET RC file, and they all have their own parsers. They're not all the same. So I got into that and had to decide, well, how should cURL actually read this file? How should we interpret? How should you be able to specify space in your password?
When you're going down rabbit holes like that, for me it's often challenging because I'll often like lose my space. Like one thing leads to another, and then all of a sudden I'm reading this old spec, and then I almost like lose track of like the initial problem that I was thinking of. Do you have an effective way of like managing those investigations or journeys? Like, do you have a system?
I think what's primarily, I have a rather strong focus on the issue that actually triggered me there. So actually a user with a problem, right? And I wanted to fix that problem. So I think that is what brings me back to the surface all the time, right? Wait a minute, the issue is still open, the user still has this problem, and that is what I'm trying to solve. So even if I go into this research mode that I find that this happened 1978, that doesn't help me, right? Because there's this problem we need to fix. So how do we get that info I found to actually fix that problem? So even if and I also have this, the biggest struggle sometimes is that, sure, I have this user with a problem that I need to fix, but I also have, I don't know how many other users that are also using that .NET RC. They've never told me about it, but I need to maintain their use cases, right? So I can't just invent a totally new way for this new user, because he might be good with that, but all the other users I need to maintain so that their files still work. And that is usually the challenge then, to make sure that I can fix the issue and not break anything of the old, while understanding the issue and making sure this is a file used for other tools as well, right? So it's supposed to be interoperable. And how do you get that? So yeah, could be really challenging at times, yes.
How do you maintain the code base in such a state that you're still able to do active development after all these years? The legacy code is a big problem. Code bases have a tendency to ossify over time. Bit rot is a very real thing, especially as you have many contributors to the same code base over a long period of time. What is your secret to ensuring that the code base stays healthy and remains a place where you can actively innovate and change stuff?
I think I've been pretty good at, mostly by chance from the beginning, but more and more by effort, to make sure that I abstract away enough in all the APIs and function calls so that I don't give out too many internals or informations about the internals, so that I am able to actually rewrite quite a lot of things internally without it being visible from the outside. That in combination with a lot of test cases, of course, so that I can actually verify that things still work the same way it did yesterday when I rewrote all the internals. And I thought of that already when I did my first code bites of curl, so that I understood that this would be a way for how we could manage things going forward without ruining backwards compatibility.
What do those abstraction patterns look like in curl? Like, what are the key interfaces?
Well, one of the primary ways is, of course, just to be very determined and persistent that we shouldn't break. So if we just made it one way, even if someone comes along later on and says, well, why didn't you do it like this, right? Much more clever and easier to use and fancier and whatever. And then we say, sure, good idea. We didn't think about it like that 2 years ago. So now we're stuck with that stupid way we did it 2 years ago. I think that's the primary way, actually. Just stick with what we have, not be tempted to do it differently just because we could, or it could be better. No, sure, it could, but we already did it the stupid way, so we stick to the stupid way. And then when I did things like in the libcurl API for the library, I originally had this idea to do the library like there's this IUCTL and FCNTL function calls in C and in libc, which is basically how to set options for a file descriptor, and it's made to do abstract functions on the file descriptor without you knowing exactly what's underneath. And that's one of my sort of original design sort of, not goals, but I was inspired by that way of doing things. So that's how I made libcurl. So nowadays you actually set options on a handle like that without knowing about the internals, really. And that has turned out to be a pretty good way. It has its downsides, but generally it works good. The number of options has grown ridiculously over time, so that becomes a different problem, but it works pretty good. So nowadays you can actually, if you get one of those examples we actually did in the early 2000s, you can mostly rebuild and use those examples still today, 20 years later.
That's I feel like that's like an aspirational goal for every programmer. Write some code, write a system that's still in use, 20 years down the road. That's
you just have it still used. Exactly. Yeah.
At the same time, you're constantly adding like new features. What are the things that are new in curl or upcoming in curl that you're most excited about?
Just if we look at the last year or two, HTTP3 support is one of those biggies, because HTTP3 is, I mean, HTTP2 was actually pretty big when that came as a new protocol for, I think, for everyone who ever implemented HTTP in any capacity. When HTTP2 came, it tore down walls and did things in new ways that nobody had thought about before. So it added a lot of challenges and new ways of doing things that actually had repercussions for a long time afterwards, with bugs and stuff like that didn't really work with HTTP2 and we still have HTTP2 bugs today because of the new ways of how we do HTTP when 2 came. And now with HTTP3, which now is an published RFC already, we sort of add another notch sort of to the, I'm not sure what to say, but maybe the complexity level. So it's pretty much, HTTP2 was a lot more complicated than HTTP1, and HTTP3 is yet another level of complications and difficulties as an implementer to do.
And this is, all the complications are in the name of like performance, like reducing latency, increasing.
Almost exclusively in the name of performance. There's also in the name of security when it comes, in HTTP3 at least, because now we have even more stuff encrypted and secured over the wire. So it's even less things readable for eavesdroppers and external parties.
Do you have kind of like an explain it like I'm 5? Like what were the big changes from HTTP 1 to 2, and then now from like 2 to 3? Like what are the major?
Okay, let me try. So cool. From HTTP 1 to HTTP 2, we changed how. One of the primary things was that we pretty much split up. So we send everything in HTTP in tiny parts, so we can send multiple connections over the same connection. With HTTP 1, we used one TCP connection for every request. And that turned out to be really bad, especially for browsers, because they want to do a lot of parallel transfers and they can't really waste a bazillion of connections. So with HTTP 2, you can do one connection and do many requests over the same connection. So by pretty much splitting up everything in tiny pieces and multiplexing it over the same connection. That is the big change with HTTP 2. And with HTTP 3, we switched from, because when you did that with HTTP 2, you send a lot of streams over the same connection, because that's the term, right? So you could do 100, typically you do 100 streams over the same TCP connection. So you get a lot of parallel data over just one connection. But that has the downside that when you have a lossy network, so you lose a few packets in the TCP connection, then all the 100 streams are all paused while you wait for that single packet to get retransmitted. So if you have a lossy network, you can lose a lot of packets. So all those 100 streams suddenly pause,
degrades very quickly.
Continue. Yeah, exactly. So when you get in a lossy network, HTTP2 becomes rather soon worse than HTTP 1, because HTTP 1 then used many connections. So if you lose packets with HTTP 1, you only, you punish one connection, not all of them. So HTTP 3 is a way to solve that by switching entirely into UDP and adding Quick on top of that. And when I say Quick now, that's not the Google Quick that Google once invented. It's now the IETF Quick. And the IETF Quick is a TCP-like protocol done over UDP with sort of included TLS. It's a lot here. So with Quick, you can set up a connection and do many multiple individual streams across that connection. Exactly like you could do with HTTP 2 and individual streams. But with Quick, you can actually lose packets, and you only punish those streams to which those packets belong. So you can actually set up one connection, 100 streams. Maybe you lose a packet or two in there. Maybe 3 of those streams need to wait until that packet gets retransmitted. The other 97 streams can continue, because it's an entirely new transport stack here. So it's not TCP anymore, it's Quick.
Okay, so there is no longer like the basic unit is no longer a single TCP connection. It's actually going over UDP, and then there's this like protocol on top of it called Quick that kind of manages this kind of like pack. I guess like it's non-stream based, but I'm guessing like Quick kind of like virtualizes streams on top of this so that it looks that way to.
Pretty much. So you get it. You actually have quick connections, and then you have quick streams over those quick connections. But those streams then become independent of each other. They're in order and reliable, but they're independent of each other, which is kind of an interesting thing because in a web context, you can actually start sending image A, then send image B, but the image B might actually arrive before image A, or it's a new way of looking at transfers. It's a bit of it takes a while to get used to. And then when Quick was added then as this new transport protocol with streams and the multiplexing independent, better for lossy networks, then HTTP3 is the new HTTP protocol done over Quick.
Got it.
The streaming, the multiplexing and everything is done by Quick, which is the TCP TLS replacement. So HTTP no longer needs to do multiplexing or streams or anything because that's now handled by the transport protocol. And since it's a completely different transport protocol, we had to do a new HTTP because it has to do different compression. So it's HTTP3 in a lot of ways is similar to HTTP2 in features and even in how it's created. But since it's done over Quick, it had to change quite a lot.
And how quickly will end users people using web browsers and command line tools start to feel the impact of the switch over to HTTP3?
If everyone who's using Firefox or Chrome today, they're already using HTTP3 to a large extent. I think up to 25% of the web traffic already from those browsers to all those the major properties. The big CDNs, Facebook, Google, Instagram, Cloudflare, Fastly, those sort of the big ones, they run HTTP3, and if you have modern browsers, they do. I think Safari is going to enable it by default too soon, and the Edge does too, of course. So they're all going HTTP3, and all the big servers are going HTTP3. Outside of those, I think it's going to be a bit slower for several reasons. Because it's difficult to deploy for if you're a smaller server company. Running it it introduces so many new challenges. UDP encrypted all the time. It looks like a DDoS attack all the time. Client-wise, it's also completely different. New libraries, new things. The stack is not in the kernel. You have to do timers. You have to do fallbacks. So yes, it's a new adventure for everyone.
Sometimes I feel like there's kind of these dual forces on the web. On the one hand, there's the people working to make the protocols as efficient as possible, squeeze every ounce of latency and bandwidth utilization out. At the same time, it feels like, front-end web frameworks, they're getting larger and larger every year. And so this web performance almost feels like this constant struggle between these forces of larger and larger payload sizes at the application level, and then at the infrastructure level, just trying to
certainly like that. A little bit like in the old days when software got slower and slower and the CPUs got faster and faster. So yeah, it's a little bit like that. And also, there's this fierce race to lower latency, right? So that's removing round trips and making sure that every round trip is actually, possibly a few milliseconds faster. But there's also at the same time, we have CDN. So all of us in the modern Western world, we have very few milliseconds to the closest server that we're actually talking to. So optimizing away X% of the RTT, we don't notice that. We can't even spot it. So even if you go, right now, if we're sitting here, you and me, if you would talk HTTP 1, 2, or 3, we wouldn't even notice the difference. So it's actually kind of ironic that the people who are actually noticing the most, they are the ones who are actually the worst networks somewhere, probably in the third world, where you have, far away from your servers, lousy networks, crappy connectivity.
I almost wonder if there's ever. I feel like people undervalue performance as a first order feature. and how important performance is. Like even like a 1 second latency, it psychologically it feels different. It's like just enough for your brain to get distracted or.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know how people do it in general, but I think that was the mindset that actually got HTTP 2 going once upon a time, right? It was almost 10 years ago now. But so suddenly people started to realizing that, speed and latency is actually very important to users and very important to all those sites, especially those, of course, who have something to sell, right? Because they realize that if you're just a little bit faster, your customers will enjoy it and they will buy more, spend more time on your site and so on. So it is very important to a lot of sort of actors on the web.
Do you think we'll ever get to the point where like websites and web apps just they feel native? Like a lot of sites I visit, there's still like loading bars, right? Like that's still a common site.
Yeah,
and
that's a very good question. Yeah, I don't know. You would hope or you would expect, but it seems like we've been doing this for so long already and we're not there yet. So I don't know. We'll see.
Maybe there'll be some movement. There's another company that I'm aware of that's building more like applications in the terminal. Their whole pitch is like terminal UI. I wonder if there might be like a low latency play there. Combining command line tools and rolling into some terminal-based interface, but maybe that's just my programmer wishful thinking, fantasizing about a zero latency world. Cool. Yeah. So I think we're basically at the end of the time here. I don't want to keep you any longer. Thanks so much for taking the time. Is there anything like last parting thoughts that you have for listeners? Like any calls to action? Like calls for contribution or maybe like financial support that would be helpful?
Oh, I forgot. I just wanted to mention that I'm actually also, I mentioned HTTP3 as something we're working on the last few years. I actually started also working on WebSockets just the last few weeks. So WebSockets is also one of those new things that we are going to land in curl this fall, I guess, in a few months or so. And that's going to be a lot of fun to see what we can do with that and what people will do with it and want with it and so on.
That's awesome. That's going to be such a huge boon for developer productivity, I think. Like having worked on some WebSockets based applications before, it's so much easier if you have like a command line way to debug things.
Exactly, and try it out and work with it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to see what people are going to do with it and want from it. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
Anything out there that people who are listening to this can help? If you have like one ask that you would make of people, what would that be?
One ask. I don't have any ask. I think if you want to help out in the curl project, just join us at curl.se and figure out there's a help us page. Might be a bit of a threshold or a high bar to get into it, but we're all friendly and you can always just ask anyone around for help. A lot of going back to what you said about people are actually thinking about we existed since the beginning of time, right? So didn't curl always exist? Because LS did, right? So but we're actually a small project in terms of how many we are and what phases that actually you can see maybe not faces, but names in the project who will show up, when you enter an issue, who will actually ask the questions. So we're usually just, a dozen or two of people who actually will respond, who will be there. So it's a small project. We're casual, we're all friendly. So it's easy access, easy to get to. So if you ever find you want to get into the project, it should be easy. And also, even if you have issues, typos in the manual or anything, file issues, and we work on it. So I think everyone who has actually do try will find it easy to work with us and easy to help out or just provide assistance, whatever. I don't think we urgently need anything, but of course we appreciate help or assistance, whenever people feel like and can help out with.
Well, my guest today has been Daniel Stenberg. Daniel, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It was fun.